Recording. I'm sharing that screen. So, all right, everything looks like it's going good. So let me know if anything is off or it's not actually recording or sending audio or video from my screen, and we will get started. So the last thing we talked about was in middle adulthood, personality types and personality traits. So we went over the big 5 personality traits. Hopefully you remember what those are and make some connections in your own life for what neuroticism or agreeableness or extroversion, conscientiousness or openness are. Remember, those are on a spectrum, so you're either maybe 100% open or 0% open or anywhere in between. Same with neuroticism, agreeableness, all of those things. So the reason we have these big 5 is because in a lot of cultures, when you do essentially factor analysis, see which kind of traits come out, these are the ones that are the most consistent across cultures. They are pretty broad. So with that, when you have really broad traits, it's hard to predict specific behaviors. So if you knew someone was at 70% on neuroticism, 30% on agreeableness, 50% on extroversion, I'm just making up numbers here. So 20% on conscientiousness and 20% on openness. Even though you know all those numbers, it might still be hard to predict in a specific new situation, how will that person behave? And that's what a lot of psychology tries to do, is look at the averages of what people tend to do. So what is the average? Years people stay married until divorce. That's a stat that we've talked about before. What's the average IQ? Those kinds of things. So using these averages and then being able to predict based on them. So while you have a little more specific number for any individual, you put them in a new situation, maybe a new kind of classroom, maybe you put them in a new kind of position in a job setting, maybe you put them with new people that they've never been around before, or in a setting with wild animals. I'm just thinking of random situations you might put someone in experimentally. It's hard to use those traits because they are pretty broad to predict specific behaviors. That being said, you can get a general sense of someone, and these traits do a good job correlating. So when you do a, say, survey and look at, say, well-being, you might look at openness, agreeableness, extroversion. You might expect from what you know now that if you're higher on openness, higher on agreeableness, you'll probably that'll probably correlate to higher well-being, and we find that that does. Higher on neuroticism is negatively correlated with well-being. So they're really useful for that and for trying to understand how people relate to other people and other things. But for trying to predict specific behaviors, it can be difficult. So there are some positives and negatives with having such broad traits. Other personality researchers had as many as 400 or more traits, and then it got kind of unruly to measure 400 different traits. So measuring 5 is a little easier to do, even though if you had good valid measures of 400 traits, you could do a pretty good job at predicting people's behaviors. That being said, not all those 400 had good valid measures at the time they existed. So the big 5 is probably the best to go with right now. All right, so some things that we really skipped over were we talked about stability across the midlife and that generally things are stable. So again, we're talking about on average, things are fairly stable. Person's personality tends to be stable. Social contexts tend to be fairly stable, but this does not mean that there cannot be change during that time. So some things that I did skip over that I wanted to talk about was this slide here about marriage. So most married individuals in midlife are satisfied with their marriages during midlife. So there is not a, so this is again on average, there's less divorce throughout midlife than there was in earlier adulthood. So we remember that the divorce was either 5 or 7. It's leaving my head right now. So about 5 or 7 to 9 years, somewhere in there. Maybe it was 7 for cohabitating and 9 for divorce. I feel like that might be the case. Or it's 5 and 7, something like that. A couple years off for cohabitating versus divorce. So generally, people are getting divorced before they get to midlife. And so if they're in midlife and they're married, they tend to be more satisfied. Still, they're seeking things like security, loyalty, emotional interests, shared interests with things. So very similar things as during dating, they're still wanting now in middle adulthood. So with this empty nest syndrome, I think we talked about this in my other class, but not this class. So with this, a lot of parents who are in middle age are having children leave the home. That's one of the markers and changes that can happen during this time, is having the last child leave home to go to college or something like that. So with this, on average, marital happiness decreases after children leave the home. So raising children is really meaningful for a lot of people when they're not directly involved with the children themselves. It oftentimes decreases their marital satisfaction and their overall well-being as well. So we talked last time about like those ups and downs, those waves of things that might make you a little more happy or a little less happy over time. This is one of those times where you might have a little dip in your overall well-being when you now have an empty nest. So one way that people deal with that is to refill that nest. We saw some videos early on in talking about middle adulthood where some people brought in their adult parents, so that were aging, to care for them in the home. That's a really common way. Another way is encouraging other children to move into the house that have moved away, so having them come back. So with that, that does lead to loss of privacy. It can lead to increased stresses and conflicts because now there's completely different dynamics if they're bringing adult children back in the house than there were before. So we talked about that a little bit from the child's point of view, from an early adult's point of view of coming and living back with parents, but for the parents as well, it can be stressful because they've been used to having, you might say, more control over the child within the home. And so the new dynamic of that child now being more of a peer than they were before is a process that they both need to get used to. All right, so with this, we talked about sibling relationships and friendships and how important those are. Grandparents, I believe in this class we talked about grandparents and how a lot of grandparents are taking a bigger role in the U.S. With full-time grandparenting, and it can be a challenge. How other cultures are maybe doing a better job with raising children in general, using a bigger group of people rather than having it be exclusively a couple caregivers. So whether it be parents, grandparents, or like uncles or something, that everybody together is working on raising these children. So with this, one thing that I don't think we mentioned is that middle adults tend to be a link between younger generations and the older generations. So their parents are probably aging, maybe moving into things like rest homes or nursing homes. And then they have their own children that are younger, maybe even they're starting to get grandchildren. So it tends to be middle adults who connect family together, who try to connect grandparents, so their parents, with the grandkids or great grandkids. So that often falls onto middle adults. So that's a really important role that they play within families. That being said, oftentimes the relationships, again, on average, when asking lots of middle adults with aging parents, a lot of times those relationships are characterized by ambivalence. They feel they're really important, but they're maybe not as directly involved as they might be with their close friends or their partners and things like that. So there is still, even though they are working to maintain relationships, there still might be a lot of ambivalence in those relationships with aging parents. So one important thing that we'll see for both middle adulthood and late adulthood that we'll get to in just a couple minutes actually is these relationships. So interesting stats, mothers and daughters. So daughters in middle adulthood and then mothers that are in late adulthood, they tend to have closer relationships. Married men tend to be more involved with their wives' families than their own families. Oftentimes a mother's intergenerational ties are more influential for grandparents. So there's probably a set of grandparents, if your grandparents are still around or you have contact with them, there's probably a set that you're closer with that on average tends to be from your mother's side. So in my case, that's not the case. And so this is, again, on average. So your lived experience might not line up with the average, and that's why a lot of these things fall on a bell curve. Some people do have that, some people don't. All right, so this is the main point I wanted to get at with a lot, especially in the transition from middle to late adulthood, is that other people are really important for physical health, cognitive health, socio-emotional health. I mean, they're really important at any time in life. This is why positive psychology focuses so much on other people. Chris Peterson was a researcher who was one of the initial people working in the positive psychology area, and this was his kind of main motto, was other people matter. And so he passed away about 7 years ago now, but a lot of his research is still really useful and has been built off of, and a lot of the people that he trained are still doing really good research in trying to build things like positive institutions that help people build relationships and positive individual experiences. So we won't go too into depth about positive psychology in general. We'll just watch a couple of these videos, probably just one of these. I like this second one, but it talks about positive psych in general. There's good and bad things about both these videos. The first one kind of sounds like a marketing spiel, and it might have been. That might have been what, in preparation for a book that he wrote or something. So I think we'll actually watch the second one, even though it doesn't hit exclusively on this point. I think it might be just a better video overall. So let me know if the audio is bad from the video going through the microphone and whatnot.
The work I do as a psychologist is within the field known as positive psychology, which has a general definition as the scientific study of what makes life worth living. In addition to happiness, positive psychologists are also interested in talents and abilities, in our passions, the things that we're really interested in. What gets us out of bed in the morning? Whether we're passionate about work, about leisure activities, about our family. My own work is focused on strength.
Oh, well, I just paused it and he's about to talk about it. So we've talked about the VIA character strengths in this class before. I even gave you a link to that scale to see what your character strengths were. When he's talking about talents and abilities, oftentimes he's using those words and he's talking specifically about character strengths. So one thing positive psychology really looks at positive institutions, positive individual experiences, and what's the third pillar of positive psychology? Why do I always remember only two of these things? I'm glad this is not my oral exam for my PhD right now, because I would be even more stressed than just wondering why I can't think of it. All right, let's pull that over here. I'm going to look 3 pillars of positive psych. Yeah, that's why. It's because I always feel like 2 of these are very overlapping. So 3 pillars of positive psychology. We've got positive individual experiences, so positive emotions. We've got positive traits, so character strengths, and positive institutions. So how can we make businesses, schools, things like that work to help people thrive? So what kind of positive individual traits will help people thrive and have positive experiences? What kind of positive emotions do we want to look for? And positive emotions are not just happiness. Things like empathy are positive emotions. Moral emotions fall under positive emotions, even though some of them, like guilt, for example, might not be necessarily pleasant to experience. They lead to positive actions oftentimes. Sorry, well, this is actually a really good video on what is positive psychology, but we won't watch it in this class, but this one's actually really good. So character strengths, really good. If you haven't done that VIA character strength survey, go ahead and do that. It'll give you a list of maybe some things that you already knew about yourself, some things that you could work on, because the character strengths, you can build character strengths. So if there's some that you really wish you had, work on those, and there's little tools and tricks and ways to build those, kind of like cognitive skills. Yeah.
Of character, positive traits like kindness and teamwork and sense of humor. Positive psychologists are also interested in the institutions that enable the good life, family, schools, good workplaces, healthy communities. What is the relationship of happiness to a life well lived? I would say that happiness is often an indicator that you're living well, but it's not a perfect indicator. A lot of the things that we do that make life worth living, raising children, for instance, doesn't necessarily make us happy. Not in the short run. In the long run, yes. In the short run, absolutely not. It's hard work. Why do we do it? Because it's the right thing, not just because it puts a momentary smile on our face or makes us feel gleeful. Happy.
So some good research there that this connects to is it's interesting to look at the overall well-being scores of parents versus non-parents and see that overall parents might score slightly lower on overall well-being or hedonic happiness. But when you look at eudaimonic happiness, which is more like connecting to also like, are you happy that you're connecting to things that are meaningful in your life? Long term, do you feel like you'll be happy as well? Those parents tend to be a little higher on. So like today, I was really frustrated and upset that my child wouldn't let me prep for the class well. Wanted coloring pages. So actually I got the coloring pages right here. So printed out the coloring pages. He wanted to make the diamond hearts purple. So that was not really positive emotions at that time. But overall, when you have family as maybe something that's meaningful or purposeful to you, overall your well-being will tend to be higher. So that's a little more specifics of what he's getting into there.
Happiness is a product of our pursuits, not necessarily the pursuit of happiness per se, but the pursuit of other things that make life worth living. So if you take very seriously your work or your family or your community, if you pursue the good in those domains, guess what? You're going to be happy as a result. Sometimes when I give a talk and I tell the audience, if you really don't want to listen to me for the next hour, listen to me for 5 seconds because I'll tell you what positive psychology is all about. Other people matter, period. I'm done with my talk. Anything that builds relationships between and among people is going to make you happy. Now the other route, it's probably related.
And so that's the main point that I wanted to get across with this is, like I said, that's kind of his motto is other people matter. And that's what a lot of relationship research in middle and late adulthood come back to. It's really interesting that a lot of the developmental psychologists who are looking at aging and thriving during aging are also positive psychologists, because the things that or positive developmental psychologists, because the things that help us build relationships in middle adulthood, in late adulthood, they're also things that help us build relationships early on. They're things that help us have more happiness and higher well-being, higher meaning, higher purpose. So these are things that help people have more cognitive health. So a lot of maybe repetition in these last couple class sessions talking about the end of life, but this is also really relevant to earlier on in life. So it's really interesting that a lot of the adult development researchers also tend to be overlapping a lot, either not necessarily positive psychologists themselves, but there's a lot of overlap with the work that they do and positive psychology.
Is to have a sense of meaning and purpose about your life, to see yourself as connected to something larger than yourself. Now, for some folks, their religion can provide a sense of meaning and purpose, and positive psychologists are not shy about acknowledging the importance of religion. However, there are secular sources of meaning and purpose as well. Making the earth hospitable for future generations. Again, friends and family, or here at the University of Michigan, it's pretty exciting for me to be reminded that I'm that my day job is talking to the best and the brightest young people in the world. Sometimes I have to remind myself of that when I didn't find a parking place in the morning. But my job is not about finding a parking place. It's about teaching. And that's meaning and purpose for me. People are always looking for the shortcuts. People are always looking for the 7 easy steps, the 5 easy ways, the magic formula. And I don't think there are such things, not if you want to have a life worth living. You have to work at it. Do volunteer work. And if you can't do volunteer work, pick up your neighbor's newspaper and put it on their porch. I mean, just really small things. If you do them over and over again, you will build the connections with other people. Just in my own life, when I was 20 years old, I was painfully shy. I would go weeks without talking unless somebody said something to me, and they usually didn't because I was the painfully shy person. And I finally decided that was no way to live, and I forced myself to be chatty. And now I can't shut up. It gives me some examples to draw on when people ask if change is possible. I go, absolutely, absolutely, it's possible.
So some clear connections to things that we've talked about a few times. He's kind of giving some overall points about positive psychology in general. Oh, I totally forgot to show you this. So with that, positive psychology has a lot to do with adult development, thriving in development. As a positive developmental psychologist myself, I do applied positive psychology. So that's why I build tools to help people thrive in different ways, help people be more pro-social, find that purpose in their life, things like that. Other ways you can do applied work is by helping people, maybe it's young people, maybe it's older people, find things in their own lives that help them thrive. So whether that's things like physical health, cognitive health, socio-emotional health, a lot of what I do is more like socio-emotional and then some cognitive intermixed rather than focus on physical health. And you can probably tell that that's the things I like to teach too. So with that, if any of you do have, that is actually a pretty good transition to this. This morning I got this from our secretary in the department that the U of U has a new bachelor's program specifically in educational psychology. And so educational psychology is a pretty applied field. So with this, here I had a couple different kinds of jobs that you, if you're interested in a educational psych degree, would be useful. So if you is this not the same thing that I looked at earlier today? I swear it was. So it's got a couple different things like school psychology, school counseling, clinical mental health counseling. If you want to be a registered behavior technician or a assistant behavior analyst, an educational psychology degree will help you get to that point. So it's very applied. It's meant to help train you to work with people specifically, not just in school settings, but a lot of the places that we can connect with, say, young people are through school settings. So school counseling, if you want to be an applied behavioral analysis person, maybe it was the other document that said the couple different types of, okay, maybe this is it. So clinical mental health. So if that's kind of your idea of where you want to go into, how you might want to use psychology in your life, this program is, so they had other bachelor's programs in psychology, but now they have this bachelor's specifically in educational psychology. So it's really applied, focused one. I have a friend who did a bachelor's in educational psychology and then a master's in educational psychology and then a PhD in developmental psychology. And currently they're working to essentially create tools and support and train teachers, school counselors, and things like that on how to help raise good children that are healthy and thriving. So these are the kinds of things you could do with educational psychology. background. And a lot of this class has been quite applied. So if you liked the applied side, if you've liked learning about what you could do to um, support and help people and use this training and not just learn kind of the facts and the basic knowledge, an educational psych degree could be really useful for you. So are there any questions about this specific degree, or are there any questions about educational psychology? I'll probably send you these documents too. So if any of these kinds of career paths look like something that you would want to do, might be a good program to jump into. So that would be a bachelor's degree program for educational psychology. There are other schools with educational psych programs. The reason I'm showing this specific one is essentially the U of U just created this educational psych program. And a lot of Salt Lake Community College students go to the U of U. So if that's what you want to do, this might be a good kind of program for you. Keep that open for my next class. All right. If you do have questions about like careers in psychology, things like that, next steps, if there's specific things that have been interesting to you, even if it might not be like my specific interest, say you're really interested in neurology and neurodevelopment and neuropsychology. I still know quite a bit about those things and can kind of point you towards different things. I remember when we first talked about interests, a lot of you were interested in that. So if that's still an interest of yours, if you want to continue on that path, feel free to send me an email. Or we could even do an office hours type of thing where I could show you some schools or something like that that you might be interested in. All right, well, with that being said, let's jump into late adult development. So 15 and 16, we've got physical and cognitive development, and then socio-emotional development in late adulthood. And then chapter 17 is going to be on the death and dying process, the end of life, the effects it has on the people that are left behind, those kinds of things. So let's jump into physical development, and we probably won't get to cognitive development today, just based on the time we have. So I know we just watched some videos. Let's watch another video about positive aging. So this is a really good example. Dr. Nakamura is one of my advisors and is a positive psychologist as well as developmental psychologist, and focused on the later parts of life. So midlife as well as the end of life and late adulthood. So a lot of good expertise in the area. So let's watch this video about middle adulthood into later adulthood, and then we'll probably watch these two as well. Oh wait, this is Dr. Nakamura's, and then this is an example of positive aging, and this one is a good another good example. So we might not watch all of these, but let's definitely watch this one. They are all really good.
My name is Jean Nakamura, and I study aspects of positive adult development, including mentoring in the professional context and social innovation in the second half of life. We've been studying social innovators who are all over the age of 60, so in their 60s, 70s, 80s. We were interested in the question of how they came to be doing what they're doing. And the vast majority of them aren't people who were actively seeking something to do to contribute to society, and they weren't people who were tapped because of their expertise to do something to contribute to society. There were people who had sort of stumbled into a problem that they felt they couldn't ignore. And wound up feeling like they needed to take it on themselves. One example of these lives organized around social purpose was an individual who had been a war vet, and when he was being treated in a VA hospital, was observing the young soldiers who had come back from the Gulf War, and realized that one of his own passions, which was fly fishing, might be something that he could share with them. And he created a program that allowed war veterans to go out into the country and experience a very restorative kind of healing activity. So essentially, he was taking his own flow experiences and sharing them with these veterans. Yeah, so we've been learning from the research that we're conducting on the daily lives of older individuals.
So if you've ever heard the term direct action in related to, say, civic engagement, political engagement, a lot of the examples that she's talking about, that's essentially what they're doing. They're seeing something that needs to be done. While her research is focused on people who are in midlife or late life, a lot of these things also are relevant to early adulthood as well. Activism, for example, might be an example of direct action, seeing that there's a problem, working to fix it, creating your own specific programs. So for people who are in middle adulthood or late adulthood, sometimes they have more networks that they're able to access. They have more experience in a couple different things that they can leverage those things. Versus in early adulthood, it might be more difficult because you don't have as many experiences, as big of a network. So it might be a little more challenging. So we see for middle and late adults, sometimes that's a little easier for them to have that self-efficacy, that they can actually do things and accomplish things, which is nice. It is still possible for someone in early adulthood as well, though.
Individuals whose lives are centered around a social purpose, that the work has both emotional and experiential costs, but also benefits, and that the benefits, like seeing the impact of one's work on others, outweigh the costs. Sort of traditional scripts for the retirement years are sort of centered around leisure, and the research that we're doing presents alternative possibilities. This has been called sort of the encore career, and the notion that another possible pathway for those years is giving back in one way or another.
So some good points there. Let's watch an example of someone who seems to be aging positively in between middle and late adulthood as well.
This is me, and this is my mother. There are nearly 40 years between us. I'd like to be like her when I get old, an 81-year-old who's full of beans.
Sure, I could come over here every day and do my gymnastics in the park.
People in Germany are getting older, and as long as their health holds out, they continue to be active as they age. How old do you feel?
Oh, that's a tough question. I usually ask people how old they think I am. But how old do I feel? I'd say mid-60s or so. Certainly not as old as I really am, thank goodness.
What's your life motto?
My motto in life is to try to not come to a standstill, to stay active, continue to look for and experience new things. When you come across something new, don't think, oh, you don't need to try that, it's not worth it at your age. But just give it a go.
That attitude makes people like my mother attractive for many companies. These so-called youthful seniors want to lead independent lives, and that means they're an important part of consumer society. And they're not averse to modern technology. Do you see how the colors are changing? That happens a lot on the internet. When you swipe over something with the mouse and the color changes, then you know you can click on it. It's like a button you can push.
Okay, but it's not doing anything. Why isn't it reacting?
My mother's generally unfazed even when things get complicated.
I'm pretty persistent. Once I've started something and feel I need to learn how to do it, then I stick with it until I can, even if it's difficult. And I have to swear at myself a little. I say, Biggie, don't be stupid. Just keep on trying. I give myself a little pep talk, and that usually works.
For my mother, taking trips is a way of staying active in old age. Travel-loving seniors have become a lucrative market for tour operators. Special travel clubs offer package tours for them. My mother's happy to spend her money on that and make her remaining years pleasant.
I don't spend much time dwelling on the future. Who knows what might happen in a week or in 6 months? I try not to think about that too much. I don't feel old, and I hope that's the way it stays for a while.
Living in the here and now.
All right, so some good examples there that are really related to some of the points that we're going to make through this chapter. There's a couple other good ones. I like this one probably more than this one, so if you want to go over any of these other videos, I'd recommend this one first over this one down here, just because it's a little longer and it's a little repetitious based on what we've talked about already. So with that, let's now talk about specifically physical health. Actually, before that, Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, the same researcher who looked at flow, and we've talked about their research before, also works with Dr. Nakamura in looking at flow, had a paper, and so you don't really need to read this. This is basically my own short summary of a research article. So I kept it in because at this point, you've read some research articles, you might be working on your second question paper. This is essentially what I do, a shorter summary of a research article. So to remember the main points of an article, I've got the authors, the year, kind of a little description, maybe some quotes, and then the main points of this article were these common conditions for successful aging. Generally, I'll also have a couple bullet points about like the methods of it, but this just kind of gives you an example of one way that I take notes on research articles, just to give you a sense of how you might do that. So you might be starting your own processes of that as well, but here's another example. So here is a more visually interesting example of the main points from that specific article. If you go and look at here, you'll see these all lined up with one of these little bubbles of things. So these are the things that help people in later adulthood feel like their life is worth living. So health and fitness and preserving mind is really important and really closely related to physical as well as cognitive health in this chapter. So other things are still related to physical health as well. So health and fitness, a lot of physical health things we'll talk about today, preserving the mind and cognitive faculties through later life. We talked about how through middle adulthood, things tend to stay pretty consistent in your cognitive abilities. And then as you get towards later life, especially at the end of later life, they start to drop down if you don't work on them. Continuing vocation, whether that's actually working at your job, like your paid work or volunteer work. So continuing doing something that's engaging you on pretty much a day-to-day basis, keeping up relationships with family and friends, probably doesn't sound too surprising based on the research we've talked about around family and friends this whole time. Staying involved in the community, so that's one way to also be generative. So a lot of similarities you hopefully see between this and middle adulthood, and then beyond the self-engagement. So even if, so probably at this point, hopefully a person has found a purpose and is either working with that, working with their family, doing that, but whatever it is, if you're engaged beyond the self, that's really, really useful, helping you make connections, helping you reach out to people around you. This can be virtual, so you can still be have physical limitations and still be connecting with people around you. So there's a lot of ways to do that as well. And we've got a couple examples, I think, in the socio-emotional chapter of people that are doing that are engaged beyond their self and how they're doing that, even if they're physically limited to one space. All right, so life expectancy and lifespan. So the lifespan is essentially the maximum number of years individuals can live. And so it seems for humans that based on our biology, the records we have, it seems like humans can live a maximum of like about 120 to about 125 years. That at that point, it's not really possible for humans to live beyond that. So we'll talk about some of these theories of aging. Why is that? Why is that the limit? And that kind of thing. So for the US, by 2030, actually I do wonder if these numbers have changed at this point now. The estimated lifespan for people in the US is 83.3 years for women and 79.5 years for men. I always think it's funny to have a point here. So like 83.3, what is that? That's like two 2 months, 4 months, something like that. Yeah, I don't like having points. So with this, there's differences in life expectancy across countries. So health conditions, medical care, ethnic differences, socioeconomic differences, these are all going to impact lifespan. So we'll see some countries have a much longer lifespan than the US. Maybe we should take that as a clue to fix some things. So centenarians, these are people that are over 100 years old. So this is increasing. So more people are turning 100 and are over 100 every single year. So about 7% each year in industrialized countries is the rate of increase. So as we get people that, yeah, we have more and more people aging past there. So I've mentioned this in previous classes and specifically around stress. Okinawa is the place where we have the highest ratio of centenarians to inhabitants. So most places it's lower than this, but here in Okinawa, about 34.7 centenarians for every 100,000 inhabitants. So there's a lot of people that are over 100. So this is a little screenshot from an interview that I thought about putting in like the YouTube video to actually watch their interview. But I really like this piece, and we're not going to watch their whole interview. But this is their reason. Why is there so many people who are over 100? So because we have a lot of fish in this village. But actually in the video, a lot of the points that they make are really relevant to the research. So diet is really important. So specific dietary needs lend to or are correlated to and even causally related to living a longer life. Low stress is one of the biggest things as well. So if you're doing something meaningful to you, if you're actively engaged and it's relaxing but also challenging but not overstressing to you, that can be a really important factor in extending your life. Being part of a caring community where people can support you, so you have supports when you say need medical care or need help moving around or need help getting a plant out of your garden or something like that. So that's really important. Activity. So a lot of what we're talking about is active things. There's a lot of different ways to be active, whether it's just mentally active or physically active, as well as spirituality is highly correlated. So people that are involved in spiritual or religious pursuits tend to be more connected to a community as well. So let's look at the risks of dying from cancer in Okinawa, Japan to the US. So here we've got, again, this is per 100,000 people. So when we look at 100,000 people, about 33 of those people in the US are going to die from breast cancer versus 6 in Okinawa. So definitely some things to learn about. And this is even different and better than Japan as a whole. So maybe some things we can learn from people around the world. So there are some theories around aging. So why do we age? Why is 120 or 125 like our maximum lifespan? Well, there's a couple different reasons. There's probably a little bit of all of these rather than only being one of them. And so hopefully you see that as we talk about them. One is evolutionary theory. So natural selection does a better job at eliminating harmful conditions before the reproductive years, essentially. So because evolution is adapting us to be able to reproduce and keep people being born and having the species continue, a lot of things that lead up to or around the time of childbearing years are selected out. But then after that, natural selection, since it's linked to that reproductive fitness, doesn't do as good of job at weeding out negative things that might happen to us in, say, our 80s. It still does affect that, because if you have 80-year-olds who are still more healthy and able to support child rearing and and helping children get raised, that is still good for a species. So it's not so late adulthood is not completely disconnected from the influence of evolution. It's just evolution does a better job at getting things right around reproductive fitness, but it also at the same time is affecting these traits are better because then older people are still able to help care for and raise a new generation and continue a species. So, but with that being said, the evolutionary theory is that evolution is more focused around that reproductive fitness rather than maybe the care of people. All right, another idea in the theories of aging is a cellular clock theory. The idea that cells might only be able to divide a maximum of about 75 to 80 times. And so different cells do this at a different rate. So neurons don't divide at all. The only way you get new neurons is a stem cell becoming a new neuron. But other cells in your body, like say muscle cells in your heart or your liver, some cells do work by dividing. And so if cells can only divide a maximum number of 75 to 80 times, if you reach that, at that point, maybe there's too many problems, too many mutations in those cells, and then the whole organ that's made up of those cells starts to fail. So this is also correlated and related, and I guess overlapping is a better word, with telomeres. And so we'll talk about those. We've mentioned them before. So with that, dividing that many times, a cell can't divide anymore. If you can't divide anymore, and then the cellular structure is dying or breaking down, organs might fail, things like that. So telomeres are the tips of chromosomes in a DNA sequence. So your chromosome is basically a big, tightly wound bit of DNA. So in all of your cells, you have each of your chromosomes. So every cell has all the DNA for your entire body. At the end, you have still more of that protein structure, the ATCG. So it's just a big, long, you could think of it as the hard part at, what is it called? I think it starts with an E. If anyone remembers what it's called, the ending piece of a shoelace. I don't have any shoes hanging around here to use as a visual aid, but that hard piece at the end kind of protects the end of a shoelace so it doesn't fray. You can think of the telomere as the same thing for your DNA strands and your chromosomes themselves. So it seems that as we age, as a cell divides, these telomeres get shorter. Aglet, okay, I was thinking it was egglet, but aglet. Thank you very much. So as we age and as those cells are dividing, if there's ever any errors in reading the DNA, so like the mRNA reading the DNA and transferring it and copying it to a new piece of DNA, usually that happens at the end of the strand. The middle tends to be safer, so we've basically evolved this extra DNA to protect itself so that the important stuff in this image, it's this blue part, is the important stuff. So maybe right here is, hey, this is how to make liver cells, or this is how to make heart muscle cells or something like that. So once that starts getting eaten into or mutated, it can lead to a lot of problems. So it could lead to things like cancer. It could also just lead to organs not functioning exactly correctly. So telomeres are a big part of that. So with that being said, it's probably part of this. The evolutionary theory is probably part of that. Telomeres are probably part of it. So here's a bigger picture. But also free radicals. So you might have heard this from and not really understood what it is. I think a lot of people who just talk about it generally with some kind of alternative medicines might not actually be understanding what they're talking about. But free radicals are essentially oxygen molecules that can damage DNA and other cellular structures. So if you think about rust in a car or anything metal, it's basically the oxygen molecule kind of burning or combusting the metal. So kind of a brief way to describe that. Kind of the same thing can happen inside our cells, in our DNA. So similar to the telomeres, as they are replicating, maybe they're replicating errors, maybe they're getting destroyed so that the next time it's not able to continue replicating further. So free radicals are essentially unstable oxygen molecules jumping around inside cells. There's oxygen all around us, so this just kind of randomly happens. And over time, there's a higher likelihood of it randomly happening. So as that builds up in different cells, leads to more aging more quickly, more cells breaking down and dying, or not being able to replicate. So mitochondrial theory is that the mitochondria itself might be decaying over time. And so we see some evidence in this in, say, mammals like rats and things like that. So all these things together, you've got mitochondria that are decaying over time, you've got the oxygen molecules damaging the DNA. You've got the telomeres being cut off by problems. And then you've got essentially evolution that hasn't fixed all of these things yet. So all those things together are probably why we age. And so depending on a specific person, it might be all free radicals or all the telomeres. But for most people, it's probably a combination of all these things. So sirtuin theory, or sirtuin theory, is essentially mitochondria and other aspects inside the cell are sending energy to different parts of the cell, the powerhouse of the cell, right? So with this, certain proteins have their certain jobs to do, and if they're not doing their job the proper way, and then the mTOR pathway theory is essentially that, I mean, at its basic form, you don't need to know all the ins and outs of this unless you're actually going into a biology class. It could be useful to know more than this. For your purposes, these are two other ways that the cells and the body itself can kind of break itself down over time. So if it's not growing and metabolizing sugars, other chemicals, nutrients properly, then the cell's life will be shorter, not be able to replicate as well. Organs can fail, things like that. So stress, this is one that I definitely want to focus on because it's something that we as humans can do a little bit more, just general, day-to-day, you and me, can do more to decrease stress levels. So we can't really do much ourselves to worry about our telomeres. They're inside each of our cells, things are happening to them, but you and me, unless we go and get a degree and start researching how to protect these telomeres, how to make them longer, things like that, you and me on our day-to-day aren't going to be affecting our telomeres that much. One thing we can do is affect our stress level. And so our body's hormone system is part of our neurological system. So we talk mostly in the class about the brain, but hopefully you remember that your hormones, your endocrine system is also part of your nervous system. So with that, when you have higher stress, your brain's going to be sending different messages. There will be more neurochemicals in your brain that make more things more easy to happen or less easy to happen, right? So stress can increase the likelihood of disease. It can make cognitive functions more challenging in some cases. So with this leads to a lot of cognitive neurological changes. So decreasing stress is one of the best ways to increase the lifespan, and one of the things that individuals can have more control over. So over time, older adults do have shrinking brains. So they're losing about 5 to 10% of the brain's weight in between the ages of 20 and 90. So hopefully you remember a little bit about the nervous system at this point, some aspects of the nervous system like axons, dendrites, axon branches, the networks of neurons. That'll come up on your final exam. So hopefully this doesn't sound too unfamiliar to you at this point. So what do you think, thinking back to that, what do you think that volume decrease is down to or is due to? What is causing the loss of weight in the brain? Feel free to either take the microphone or you could also put it in the chat box. Any ideas you might have.
Is some of the neurons dying? Is that why we lose some of it?
Yeah, that's a good idea, that some of the neurons might be dying, and so if enough of the neurons die, then we might lose some of the weight. Yeah, good idea. Any other ideas as well? Oh, I see a comment in here. So a loss of neural connection pathways. Yeah, so we've talked about how at about age 2 or 3, getting more connections actually adds to the mass of the brain. So if you're losing those neural connections by, again, really good point, by not using them, you might lose some of the mass of your brain. Good. Any other ideas that you might have?
health problems?
Yeah, health problems can definitely make a big impact. So we're talking here specifically about on average, most people tend to lose 5 to 10%, but if you have something like Alzheimer's or another kind of health problem, you can definitely lose a lot more of your brain mass from that. So really good point. And any other health problems might contribute or help contribute to these processes. All right, we've got another comment as well. The circulatory system and vasculature wearing down. So if you have smaller blood vessels, you're not getting the nutrients, the energy, the everything that those cells need, those neurons need to work as efficiently. So good. I think you hit all of the main points here. So yeah, those are exactly the reasons that we see this decrease in brain volume. So shrinking neurons because of things like blood vessels not getting the energy they need. We do have neurons dying as well. Lower numbers of synapses, so those connections, if you're not using them. This is also related to loss of neural connection pathways. So the complexity of axons, maybe before you had, say, 5 branches off an axon, but now you only have 3 instead. So when you have that all over the brain, it contributes to that loss of mass for both axons and dendrites. So yeah, cells dying themselves, because again, your neurons don't replicate. They have to come from a stem cell. So if it dies, you've lost that. If you're losing neural connection pathways, you lose that. But those can be regained. Then the shrinking of neurons, generally because they're not getting the proper nutrients or you're not using it as well. So if you're not using it, your body's going to try and conserve energy and not send as much energy to those neurons. So that you can't, if you have vasculatory problems, there's other health behaviors that you can do to improve that. But your body, even with a healthy vascular system, if you're not using specific neurons, it might not be sending as much energy and nutrients to that specific neuron too. So really good points. I'm glad that it seems like you're remembering the nervous system pretty well. So you'll do good on those questions on the semi-cumulative final. So good job. So with this, that slowing of function in the brain happens because of this loss of connections, because neurons are not working as efficiently. And we do see it just on average. But again, a lot of these things are things that can be, and we'll talk about this more when we get to cognition specifically, can be worked on and can be built up. So this can do things like affecting physical coordination, making it harder to have, say, hand-eye coordination, slower intellectual performance. The synapses are not working as quickly, and then producing neurotransmitters as well. All of that can impact just your day-to-day behaviors. So a family member of mine has multiple sclerosis, for example, and that affects neurons. So a lot of it's affecting the myelin, but it affects neurons in other ways too. So sometimes they're speaking, they're talking, and then they just can't come up with the next piece of it. So that's something that you might see in someone who's in late adulthood as well, without a degenerative disease like that. So with this, there is neurogenesis in a couple specific parts of our brain. It's probably not going to, I mean, we might see more in the future that maybe we have more neurogenesis in other parts, but it doesn't seem like we're getting new neurons to replace the old ones. The biggest thing to help the brain adapt as you're aging is this dendrite and axon growth. And as we've talked about before, using it is one of the biggest help. Also getting proper nutrients, eating proper foods, those are really important too. So brains are plastic. They tend to rewire to compensate for losses. So we've mentioned this in the case of like losing a portion of your brain to, say, brain damage. Older brains will be doing this automatically. The more you're using it, the better or quicker job it should be doing, especially if you're putting in proper nutrients to your body. So also, it does seem that for older adults, they have a decrease in lateralization. So that's rather than using both hemispheres, they tend to use only one hemisphere. So that improves cognitive function, because then if you're only using this side of the brain, you're sending the signal a shorter distance. It can happen a little faster. So this might just be an aspect of brains over time are just learning to be more efficient. So by that time, human brains are just being more, are doing better job at keeping the messages in one specific spot. But this is something we see for aging brains. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This just looks like normal human development has learned to be a little more efficient by that time. So here's I think this came from your book actually. So younger adults are using this part of their brain, and then older adults are using, I mean, this is maybe the opposite of what we were just talking about stats wise, because in this example, older adults are using both parts of their brain. But in general, older adults are using the brain material close by. So physical appearance and movement, generally you see things like wrinkles and age spots. You tend to see people getting even shorter in late adulthood, so it becomes more obvious by this point because of mostly the bone loss in the vertebrae, the connective tissues, not being able to hold the spine up as well, squishing of the spine. Weight tends to drop after age 60 because of muscle loss, bone density as well. An interesting fact that I was really surprised with when I heard about it the first time was we tend to talk about people having falls and breaking limbs, like breaking a hip, and that could be really detrimental. Interestingly, what usually happens is because of bone density loss and frailty of bones, generally a person will actually fall because their bone has broken. So rather than them falling and then as they are falling, like hitting a stair or something and then breaking their hip, actually it seems like for most people who have that kind of fall injury, it's that their bone essentially spontaneously broke and caused them to fall, which I think is a really interesting finding that I hadn't considered my whole life. But that's one reason that it's good to do research on these kinds of things so we can see, well, what is happening? Because if it's not that they're losing balance and then falling, it's that the bone just literally breaks and then they fall. Working on bone health seems like it might be more important than I would have personally thought before that. So interesting things. Here is just kind of a breakdown of the percentage of muscle, bone, fat, and other aspects. So the weight of organs, for example, throughout the body. So you can see muscle decreasing from 30% to 15%, bones also decreasing, and fat increasing. So this is again on average. So some of the people in these studies were doing good health behaviors. Some of these people in these studies, well, in both the samples, were not doing good health behaviors. So increasing good health behaviors, eating well, exercising, will make these changes less dramatic for any individual. So some other things to talk about are sensory changes. So visual decline. So cataracts are one example of one way that vision can be harmed in later adulthood. This can also happen in middle adulthood, but it becomes more and more common as you age. So that's the thickening of your eye's lens, making it more cloudy, opaque, oftentimes more stiff as well. So glaucoma is damage to the optic nerve specifically because of pressure created by fluid buildup in the eye. Macular degeneration, that's basically what this one is showing, is the retina's macula. So basically the center of your visual field, the neurons, the sensory neurons, the rods and cones, not functioning quite as well. So cardiovascular system and lungs, we had the comment a little bit ago that the circulatory system is not working as well overall in age, and this contributes to neurons not functioning as well. It can contribute to other organs not functioning as well. Also, it's a lot of as well as that. So high blood pressure is very common. It's linked to illness, obesity, anxiety, stiffening blood vessels, and a lack of exercise. So lack of exercise can be a causal factor or a preventative factor if you are exercising to prevent this. So lung capacity tends to drop as well. And so obviously if you're doing something like smoking, that's going to be worse. So sleep, 50% of older adults report having difficulty sleeping. So if we look at the numbers from childhood to adolescence to early adulthood, middle adulthood to late adulthood, you can see that trend of sleep problems becoming more and more likely as we're aging. So things like insomnia, sleep apnea, things like that. And that's linked to physical and mental health problems. If you're not getting enough sleep, it's going to be harder to think, for example, do cognitive tasks and have high cognitive function. Also, sleeping too much, so sleeping a whole lot, predicts early death as well. So those people who are sleeping a whole lot, it is actually really predictive of earlier death. So there's a appropriate balance of sleep and activity levels. If you're sleeping all the time, you're probably not getting the exercise you need. Brain's not functioning at the level it needs to be. So there is a balance to be met there. And this is why talking with a doctor specifically about your sleep habits is really important. So, and problems that you might be having sleeping, sleep apnea, for example, not being able to breathe during sleep, that can be fixed pretty effectively with like a CPAP machine. And it might take a little bit of getting used to, but then if you're sleeping better, it's going to have a lot of impacts on your life. So good to get treatments. So this is a little bit of a breakdown. We talked about how a lot of these changes don't really happen till the very end of late adulthood. So this is a really good example of that. From 65 to 74, these are the kind of losses you can kind of expect on average with your vision. And then after 75, what you might expect there. So loss of acuity, harder time seeing in the dark, a little bit of difficulty seeing colors. Then after 75, significant loss of acuity, significant loss of color discrimination. So being able to discriminate that something's, say, green, teal versus blue. And then a decrease in size of the visual field, so the narrowing. So while your peripheral vision might be here now, it might be down to here. As well as cataracts and glaucoma become more and more likely after 75. So here is for hearing. So at 65 to 74, high frequencies are going to be challenging. Middle frequencies might have some loss, but with these, both of these can be helped a lot with hearing aids. And then at 75, you're getting essentially more of that high ranges are lost, and then you're going to have a lot more likelihood of having middle ranges lost as well. So at this age, 75 and older, a hearing aid is a lot of times more necessary or more likely to be necessary than at 65. Because when you're losing those middle frequencies, that can be challenging to hear things like people's voices and talking and being able to communicate, which can make it challenging to do things like get out and be involved in your community. So hearing, vision, these kinds of senses can be really helpful for doing the other kinds of tasks that we need to keep ourselves healthy. So these are the most prevalent chronic conditions in middle to late adulthood. So the bluey teal is from middle adulthood, 45 to 64, and then the purple is late adulthood, 65 and over. So you can see how most of these pretty much just are higher, some of them significantly higher in late adulthood. So some like orthopedic impairments of the back, chronic sinus problems seem to be about the same, but diabetes, heart conditions, hearing, hypertension, arthritis, those all tend to jump up. So when we're looking at health capacities, in late adulthood, they're kind of declining, versus cognitive capacities are staying pretty consistent. And then if you use them, you can keep them. It can be a lot harder for physical health capacities like arthritis, hypertension, and other heart conditions. So here, that's just kind of showing the same thing. Blue is one chronic condition, red is two or more, I guess kind of a salmon, is two or more chronic conditions. So they're just kind of jumping up. It's more likely you're going to have chronic health conditions the older you are. So this is kind of bad news, or you look at that and you say, well, that doesn't look very nice or fun, but a positive thing that I want to point out is cognitive capacities do tend to stay pretty level even across late adulthood, and we'll focus a lot on what things to do to increase cognitive capacities. It's going to be a lot of repetition from what we talked about in middle adulthood, actually. So with this, yeah, probability increases, chronic diseases are more common, lots and lots of cardiovascular diseases. So with cardiovascular disease, it is the leading cause of death worldwide. So health behaviors, exercise, eating well, those are ways to help prevent this. So healthy oils and fats, yeah, getting macronutrients that you need is very important. Arthritis. Accidents are a lot lower likelihood of causing death in older adults. Falls, we talked about this already, are a leading cause of injury for older adults. Generally, like we talked about, it's actually a limb or say something like a hip breaking and then causing a fall, rather than getting off balance and falling, then causing the limb to break. So exercise, here's some preventative things to do. Exercise, exercise, exercise. We've talked about this, I think, every single age time. We've talked about the recommendations for exercise and the minutes of high intensity exercise in childhood, middle childhood, adolescence. Same thing here. In late adulthood, you need to be exercising as well. Things that are working your heart and working your lungs are really important, especially. So with this, yeah, the immune system, cellular functioning, when your circulatory system is getting the nutrients to different places in your body, those organs in your body are going to be happier. So with this, it can also help with cognitive capacities too, motor skills. Oftentimes you see these pictures, these people are together working out, running, jogging, walking through a park, doing some exercise program. That's another really good way to make connections with people, be out the one of your own just house, things like that. So a lot of repetition. That's why I'm kind of skimming through this. So with this, specific vitamin supplements to slow the aging process and specific kind of nutrient changes, going to a doctor specifically for yourself is going to be the best for that. So you can get a doctor that specializes in things like nutrition and work with them to see what kind of nutrients you are lacking, what your own physical or cognitive challenges are, so what kind of supplements you might need to or want to take. So there's not some overall general things are be exercising, eating healthy foods. It's kind of the general things. Another thing that can be very helpful is geriatric nurses, so people that are helping treating healthcare problems in late adulthood. It can also be helpful to be a nurse at this time in life too, because you're caring for others who might have similar problems, making connections with them. That can be really helpful too. So the one thing I do want to make a point of when we're talking about nursing homes and patients in nursing homes is it can be a really good context. It can be a really good context for getting more immediate care, having more support, having community, having activities to do. So nursing homes can be good for a lot of those things. But there's a really big impact of the person's own feelings of self-efficacy and self-determination in predicting their lifespan within a nursing home context. So those people who felt that their choices were under their own control, they could choose their activities, meals, when and where to go, things like that. So people who had more ability to make choices and do things on their own rather than having things dictated to them or their schedule set by an outside force, they were alive longer, they lived longer, up to 18 months later, than the 30% who felt that they didn't have control, that they were more dependent, And so some of that dependency might be because of physical challenges. If they have to have someone push them in, say, a wheelchair, it can be harder to feel like they are independent. So doing things, especially for someone who is, say, wheelchair bound, to help them feel more independent, to give them more options and more choice, will help them live longer, will help them live healthier. So residents who are in more control of their choices, they can do things, or are supported in the things that they can do, are going to live longer, healthier, happier lives. This is kind of an interesting flip on what we talked about in early childhood, that as a child gains more capacities, let them do things on their own. Today, at breakfast time, my 4-year-old was like, hey, I want to use the knife to cut the strawberries myself. And that was terrifying. But I helped him use the knife to cut the strawberries. I tried to teach him about being safe with the knife. I'm not going to let him do it on his own. I still watch my 8-year-old, and I'm right there too. But same kind of thing at the other end of the lifespan. Things, especially in a nursing home setting, it's easier for staff to take care of the patients and these people that they're working with. But the more that they can do to let the person be independent is going to tend to help increase their well-being and the length of their life. And that can be really hard when you've got so many people to care for. It's maybe you can do it so much faster, but if it's something that they're capable of, probably letting them do that is going to be better for their mental and physical well-being than doing it yourself, even though you might be getting it done faster. So similar kind of thing, just at the opposite end of the age spectrum. So encouraging people to be independent. So that's just a graph that says the same thing. All right, so let's stop there and we'll talk about cognitive functioning in late adulthood next time. I know I've kind of built up to this. Some of it will be repetitious based on all the cognitive things that help up to this point in life. They're all still really helpful at late life. So definitely important things, some repetition in this, and we'll talk about it next time. So thank you for being here today. That'll be the end of class today.